This morning, if you want to, you may open up your Bibles. We'll be in 1 Samuel and probably 2 Samuel some this morning as we continue our investigation, conversation, and reflection on the history and geography of the biblical story. We are positioned this morning right at the close of the reign of Saul and the introduction of the reign of David and then Solomon, paying attention to many of those details. And so we're kind of making sure we connect all those dots as we note that. Before we get further along, though, if you would bow with me in prayer, and we'll begin our study after that. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the blessings that you find so gracious to give to us. Help us to then be good stewards of our lives, your word, and that grace. Help us in all things to be focused deeply and richly on becoming more like your Son. And we offer this prayer in your Son's name. Quick logistics thing. You probably have noticed that those who are paying attention to the weekly emails that get sent out midweek, those are ahead of our study. And so if you're trying to figure out where you are based on those messages, note that those are a little ahead of where we're going to be in the class. We're still fairly close to the original syllabus. With obviously moving back and forth a little bit to make sure we adjust our circumstances to what's important for us during the class itself. A couple things for today are to kind of tie together these details. Firstly, wanted to bring this up. This is the placard that's presented at Tel Tasit. Is it not doing its thingy? That's probably an important thing for me to press that extra button.
I think you were sharing something, yes.
Yeah, there you go. Hey, look what's up there. That's the placard. So this is your standard representation of everything. What this is, it kind of shows us one of the various archaeological dig sites. And I realize it's a little pixelated for you all, but I wanted to present two things from this. Number one is that this is pretty much how any archaeological site gets presented in Israel. It is basically, like I've said a few times, a giant mound of dirt. That's because of the way that history has occurred over there, in that there's a conquest redoing over and over and over time, except some of them actually are small hills, and that's what this one is. And so all of the archaeology is on top of the small hill. So they have a tell on top of a smaller little mountain, like we might consider a hill, for our kind of experiences and frame of reference. For note for us is to pay attention to what's kind of going on over in this section here, and then again paying attention to it because down over here, this little open area here, that area is the space in which the story of David and Goliath takes place. That's the location historically where it occurs in that spot. And if you're on the ground looking up at that place of dirt, you would now be standing possibly somewhere within, let's say, 100 yards to 500 yards of where the conflict would take place. This is right on the edge of the stream bed, which goes in between that high tell or mound and then tell on top of it, and where the Philistines would have been encamped. And so now you are able to kind of get a look at what the summer season looks like. Actually, this photo was taken right there about 2 years ago. And so today, it probably looks very much like that. A very little difference from that. So this gives you an idea or a context to think about when you're picturing these Bible stories. They're not just stories. They are narratives telling us something that happened, but they happened on the ground with reality, with blood, with people, with sorrow, with joy, with sweat, with tears. All those things take place when this event occurs. Now, we talked about this last week. We'll talk about it again just a little bit to move into this. The way in which the story of the arc of Saul's life is going is a shift in his character as presented. early Saul seems to have a higher sense of humility. There seems to be that case. And he seems to look and act in God-focused and Israel-focused ways. But slowly that is shifting from the way the story tells us these events, in that jealousy seems to be a component of his second stage character. And David here, who is intermeshed in the story with us at a couple different points, because there are two historic presentations of how young David interacts with Saul. This one is the one that spikes jealousy. The other interactions are him serving in the court as a singer, as a musician. And it becomes apparent that his quality as a musician is appreciated by Saul in that it can do what for him? It calms him. Now you want to think about some things here. Whatever's going on in his life, he had been humble, but now he's not. The kingdom is gradually being pulled from his grasp. David is the only one who seems to be able to soothe him. That's all we know. That's like the information in residence for our facts. Further, we know that eventually, at some point in these early spots, they are both actually God's anointed for two different purposes. One is still anointed and serving as the king until God decides that's to end. And we've learned through reading the text that David actually doesn't know when that's going to happen. And David becomes anointed as the future king, not knowing when that's going to happen either. There is a level of interplay in those two experiences that then become important for us to play off this now. What kind of relationship prior to the pursuit of David does Saul and David seem to have? Is it really healthy, or would we notice some things about it that seem problematic? What are some things that happen? What was that? He straight up tried to kill him. He threw a spear at him. You think that's normal behavior? Would you go, you know what, that matches what I think is normal good behavior. I got this guy who's a musician, and he's the only one who can make me calm down, but I think I'll kill him. Further, what other kind of external things have we talked about that kind of tie into David's rise to prominence? What do they sing about Saul and David when Saul and David return home?
Saul killed his 1,000, David killed his 10,000.
Oh, that's not good, right? If you're Saul, if you believe that your place there is in part due to your popularity, but then there's also some other interplays that happen internally. Because Saul is initially looking at David and saying he's great, but then he goes to this jealous phase. He becomes friends with his son, successful raids against the Philistines. There's actually two other times that we talk about that in the process of this, Saul tries to kill him. I don't know about you, but I think about things this way. If something happens and I realize that I made a mistake, it was unwise, I go, okay, I'm not going to do that again. But if it happens a second time and I choose to be there, maybe the problem's not them, but the problem's me. Like I shouldn't be there. I should leave. David's there multiple times, still staying there. And it makes me think, like, what's going on? One, can David leave? Doesn't seem to have the capacity to do so. Because when he leaves, what happens?
Saul goes angry.
Yeah, I think there's an implicit thing for us to catch that in essence, when David finally comes to the conclusion that I have to leave or I'm going to die, he's going to leave and Saul's going to chase him. Like this is not just a factual thing for us. This happened. We also can kind of catch that he is aware of the consequences because David is, in no sense, an idiot. It just doesn't have any clue. He's obviously indicated to us of having good sense of presence, good understanding, and knows that this is going to be outcome by his behavior. And so this thus begins the pursuit of David. There's a couple of things that happen in this historical narrative, but David's making his way. He first goes to Ramah to see Samuel. Seems pretty smart, right? Go to the one who anointed you. On a human level, the conversation could go something like this. Hey, why'd you get me in this kind of trouble? Human level, okay, you're the one who put me over here. I was happily tending sheep out in the wilds, and now the king's trying to kill me. The story actually is far more nuanced than that, right? There is actually an appreciation for God's plan for him. There is some additional steps that takes place as he goes then to Nob, and then he goes to Gath. Gath is interesting because this is what he does while there. He goes before King Achish, who's Philistine, and pleads that he is insane. Is he insane? He is not. Does he present a good look of what it might seem to be to someone who is insane? Like, this guy looks insane?
Apparently so.
Apparently so. Does he have any information available to him that would indicate to us he's been upfront and personal with someone who we might consider insane? Do you think Saul's behavior is the behavior of a normal person at this point? We might use a more colloquial phrases. It seems as if Saul has lost his ever-loving mind. And it's a multiple of factors that are taking place to kind of produce that. Sympathizers who learn of David's condition start surrounding him, and he gathers unintentionally or consequentially 600 men around him. They're not necessarily presented to us as being the highest moral character, but they are presented to us as being capable. Capable men who are now in support of him. Saul then pursues David. And look at his behavior. What happens at Nob? Destroys it because they helped him. David then travels to the wilderness of Ziph. And so David has his 300 or 600. Saul has his 3,000. And David will go back then to the land of Gad, or Garth in this case. And they learn that David was no longer in favor with the Israelites. And he is welcomed. He actually is given the city of Ziklag in that interlude. This area here that we're looking at and thinking about is full of wadis and stream beds that look like this. This is the water of En-Gedi. So this fills the En-Gedi Wadi that comes in, that eventually runs to the Dead Sea as it goes downward. But it's positioned right along the edge of the area in which David seems to kind of be, in essence, trying to elude Saul. So this is the region he's in. He's gone back to an area where he was of great triumph. He's gathered together the emblems of that triumph. And he's gathering, in essence, an army from those he had triumphed against. He's building his army in the Philistine strongholds. So he's gone from a place where he was seen as the usurper. He was seen as the enemy, even though he was useful because of his music. He is pursued to his death, and he escapes to the land where he has great power. This is where you start seeing that David is a little bit crafty, because he's got a reputation down there. He is the guy who killed their guy, and it was known. Saul, in this context, though, is still having to deal with the Philistines, because as we can tell, Philistines haven't been defeated. They're still there. And so the story is taking place while there's still ongoing conflict. They'd gone through the Canaanite territory, turned east toward the plain of Jezreel, and they were laying claim to that whole area, chunking off a large portion of what should be Israelite land. The Israelites would then meet them finally in the battle surrounding Mount Gilboa. Israel is defeated. Saul and 3 of his sons are killed, and their bodies are nailed to the wall of the city of Bet Shean, which is this city right here. And so you're looking at this city. This is tied into the text of 1 Samuel in chapter 31. Bet Shean is a 3-stage historical city for our purposes as you get close to the mid to the late Bronze Age and beginning into the early Iron Age. Right around 1000 to 980 or 970 BC is the time frame you're thinking about. And so you've got to see this here. So this right here shows us what would be the Roman influence later down the road is all of this area. So that's a Roman all the way down to about here. So this area right here becomes a Roman outpost later. Off and to the edge of it, there's the evidence of the Egyptian outpost underneath it. But our purpose here is to pay attention to the large mound in the background. First thing to think about, anytime you see anything in Israel where it's all flat and all of a sudden there's a big mound, all right, what happened there? Universally, even if it is legitimately a mountain, on top of it, something happened there. And in this case, up at the archaeological features you can see on the very top of that mountain, that is the fortress structure whereupon Saul's sons' bodies were hung. This is Bet Shean, the same place in our text we're reading right here, where this all took place. This is the closing portions of that section of Saul's reign. It's all over here. This is all really bad, really awful. Israel itself now is essentially in substantial distress. People from their cities are kind of leaving and going all the way around it, all this area. Palestine at this point is covering 12,000 square miles. Saul controlled no more than half of that. His last battle left the land divided, the Philistines having firm control in their part. And the people still basically lived, though, in their original tribal territories. The kingdom, by all standards, is an absolute mess. There's nothing really super positive that we can pull from the outcome of the reign of Saul. I want you to think about that. When this begins, Samuel's interaction with God is one of defeated. I don't know what I've done. I don't know why they're doing this. God's response is, they're not doing this to you, Samuel. They're doing this to me. They want a king. Their request is we want a king like everybody else's. And so they get exactly that. And they get the outcome that happens when you have a king like everybody else's. And I want you to think one more step and think about the behavioral arcs, the small ones, of all of the judges that are presented to us in the second half of the book of Judges. All of those individuals rise in power, they're victorious, and then power corrupts them and they want more, or they abandon their oaths, their commitments. Because they have getting worse and worse. And so now we get our first king. We got a king. We have our first king. We're Israel. We got a first king, and he's great at the start. He's wonderful. He looks like a king. He acts like a king. He leads like a king. He's even humble like a king that has never been before. And then he's not. And actually he tries to become involved in the spiritual things out of his own pride. Oh, I thought Samuel wasn't here, so I just offered the sacrifice. Oh, and God, by the way, what we're going to do is we were going to offer this to you later. I just kind of decided to do that, even though you had told us to do something entirely different. Not a great beginning to the idea of monarchy, right? It would be wonderful if that was like an only time thing. Like, oh, that was just a bad one. But as we remember, if we think about our more in-depth study of the Old Testament texts, how many truly competent, and I'll say this very carefully, mostly good kings did Israel have? We're like, maybe 2 or 3. And that's only because, we're thinking about it being gracious. Even those that fit in our category of, these are pretty good kings by comparison, still had aspects of their kingness, their kingship, that came into conflict with God's expectations for them. They're men, so they're not perfect. We know that. And so we have this limited pool. That means the overwhelming majority of all the kings, whether they're the United Kingdom, the divided kingdom, the remaining little tiny kingdom, were flawed in very specific ways. Very often showing us how important the spiritual kingship of Christ would be, although it's presented in the Old Testament in its Hebrew terminology, the Messiah. And so that's the anointed one. And that's the neat thing about it. You have God's anointed men, Saul and David, creating lines. Neither of them truly kept their kingship in that way. And then God's true anointed comes later and is so more like what they needed, and in some ways what they seem to have wanted. So that closes out 1 Samuel. Note also that its closer isn't that much different thematically, although the depth of depravity is different than how Judges closes. You would argue that in Judges they actually held more land. They had more of the land that was conquered in their possessions. By the time we get to the close of 1 Samuel, that's certainly not the case. 2 Samuel comes and reveals to us the household of David. This right here is pretty much, and I say this carefully because I know there's a few things that are a little bit older and a little bit more clear, but this is the one that is 100% attested to. So this is the first physical inscription of the house of David in a archaeological find that has been identified. So they know that this is referring to the David of the scriptures and the family of the rule of Israel. This particular one is found in the court entrance areas to the Tel Dan space. So this one right here. And so you see me circling what looks probably like, what is that? A little script there. That is Hebrew. In this case, the script is a little earlier script. Proto-Hebrew is what we sometimes refer to it as. It's a Semitic script, and it means house of David. That's all that it's not super complicated. This is actually housed in the Israeli Museum of Antiquities in Jerusalem, and so it presents to us the physical link to the story of the Old Testament. There are lots of literature references to David. Most of those literature references to David as king come well after the time period of this particular artifact. And so this is the earliest, most well-attested physical piece of the reign of David that is known to exist in the history of Israel and Palestine and the world. All of our copies of the Bible, physical copies of it, are all newer than this. And so, all the ones we know of. And so you're looking at saying, well, where's our tangible Davidic evidence? Well, on that level, it starts here. Doesn't mean that the Bible is inaccurate, doesn't mean it's not inspired, doesn't mean any of those things. It just means those are two different streams of evidence. So historically, we've got this, which says, yeah, David was a king in Israel at this time. And he's a king is a little different, because we struggle to define who he is, right? The Bible tells us that he is a person, a man after God's own heart. And then we have the intellectual dissonance to say, now wait a minute, what does that mean? And why is that so troubling to me? Why do we get that phrase and get difficult emotions about David as being a person after God's own heart? What was that? He did some certainly awful sinful things. I mean, would you consider someone who plotted the murder of his chief commander because he wanted to hide his infidelity as a godly person today? If that's all you knew. If that was like, this is our commander of our country, or maybe the king, and he just said, all right, I'm going to make sure that my infidelity straight up just is not knowable, and the best way to do that is to kill one of my soldiers and pin it on him, pin the pregnancy on him. We'd be like, no way. Certainly not someone like that. The problem comes in our saying, well, this phrase means more than it actually means. We turn that phrase and say, he's perfect. He's got to be perfect. Clearly he's perfect. Because we want that to mean that. Let me rephrase it this way. Do you believe you are trying to be a person after God's heart? I hope the answer is I'm trying. We may not believe that about ourselves for any number of reasons, but we're putting forth the effort. This phrase that comes in here of its use in Acts chapter 13 and verse 22 is indicating more generally a concept of his effort. He is making the attempt to be as God would have him to be. But like every king that surrounds Israel, his failings are recorded for us, and at times they are cosmically epic. So also are the successes of some of these kings. And the struggle then of this dissonance in our head and our heart about this is also this reality, that the forgiven man can stand blessed before God. I will tell you, and you've probably experienced this yourself when you talk to someone about the offer of the salvation found in Jesus, that their sins can be forgiven, and they look at you and go, yeah, but not mine. That's what we're seeing here. We're seeing that conflict that incurs in others, and it probably has incurred in you at some point. Like, yeah, someone else can be forgiven, but I'm not sure God's going to forgive me because I am aware of what I did, and I am aware I was wrong, and maybe I was aware when I was doing it. Because remember, how crafty is David? How aware of his circumstances was he up till this point? Pretty aware. Because the guy ain't no dummy. Kind of happily just going along. Crafty, committed. And so even in this small section, there's a lot more going on. The Bible tells us in Psalm 32, verses 1 and 2, blessed is he whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Blessed is the man to whom the Lord does not impute iniquity, and in whose spirit there is no deceit. The Bible story that we'll pay attention to in brief as we kind of walk through it hints to us and suggests to us that there is that whole interaction with the prophet that then clarifies our perspective of David, that his heart's stubbornness is shattered at that moment. And look, we're seeing him do what happens to a lot of humanity. He's doing mostly the same thing that Saul had done, just in different ways. Saul's ego was shattered, so fragile by David's success that he couldn't handle it. He was like, I gotta kill him. David's sin was so substantial at a period of time where he was at his height of power that he began to behave although we don't know all the motivators, behaved as someone who thought, I can do whatever I want. I'm king, there's no consequences. What are they going to do? My level of success is unparalleled. I'm not some weakling like Saul. There's no David hanging around somewhere to take this from me. That's our analyzation of the behavior. Doesn't give all the full pictures, but we certainly see a lot of that in the Psalms when he talks about his regret. Note for us, no other person in the Bible has more ink connected to their name. He goes from 1 Samuel chapter 16 all the way to 1 Kings 2. Half of the Psalms are attributed to him. As we think about the history of his life, realize that our lives are enriched as we see the impact of the ebb and flow of his faith as it goes weak and then gains strength. His capacity of love for doing things that are good. And his deep grief over sins he committed as presented to us in the poetry of the Psalms. And I'm going to make a point real quick here of how we read and think about the Psalms. Outside of the Bible poetry, does anyone have a favorite song lyric or modern poem that they can remember right now and they're willing to share? Those are two things. And I'll even include commercial jingles because they're basically the same thing. So if you remember a commercial jingle that's stuck in your head.
Little dab will do you.
Little dab will do you, right? You think about the way in which our mind gets fixated over that little phrase. Now, that little commercial phrase, right, is designed to link us to a larger thing and maybe not always be literal. Sometimes these things are metaphors or pictures. Hey, Rich, can you remember any lyrics from a Rush song for us real quick? Or your brain just shut down?
Oh, no. Let's see.
Tom Sawyer?
You can decide not to choose, but you still have made a choice.
Right, you can decide not to choose, but you still have made a choice. Those are poetic phrases that we have to then interpret. We got to think about it. What's going on there? Because we understand that nearly always with poetry, with prose, the literal meaning may not be the thing, but there's a history underneath it, right? So I'll co-op a current cultural thing that's a regular thing. A lot of folks will tell you, and they're probably true, that the current one of the current most popular female songwriters and singers, Taylor Swift, basically only writes about breakups with her relationships. I'm not an expert in that. I cannot comment. I certainly don't know her entire discography of all of her works, but it certainly matches my surface level impression. So everyone then kind of goes, hey, wait a minute, who's this song talking about? And there's apparently an entire subgenre of the world that tries to decipher her entire life on the basis of her songs, and like a word. That's nothing new because we've done that for years with singers trying to figure out what's going on in their lives is what prompted them to write. Oh, by the way, it's not just singers, it's an art. If you go to a museum and you see a portrait painted by an artist from 1700, and you're like, what was going on in their life? Why is she sad? Okay, now I say all of that because Hebrew poetry, which includes some of the songs in the historical books, Proverbs, even some of the work of the prophets and the Psalms, has to have that same underneath it experience as well. And the reason it's really valuable here is unlike some of the Psalms and some of the Proverbs, which are easier to source out or connect to things, most of the Davidic Psalms, we can go, this psalm seems to be talking about this part of David's life. And we do that sometimes, right? When we think about his grief over loss, or when he talks about in hyperbolic terms about the grief over the loss of his child from this illicit union, we go, okay, this is about that. Let me offer a little tiny bit of caution on two edges when we're doing that. Number one, even though it may be incredibly well attested that we believe this psalm refers to this event, unless the Bible makes that connection, be careful with what you do with that information. You may be entirely wrong, like 100%. Secondly, even in the cases where you're right, or the Bible makes that connection, unless the scriptures take that psalm and make it literal, you need to remember it's poetry. It's prose. It has an edge of you requiring some time to think about what it means aside from its literal inclusion. And to cite the modern American poet Ice-T, when he says, check yourself before you wreck yourself, although he said, check yourself before you riggedy wreck yourself. When he says that, he's not talking about an automobile, right? It's intended to be a metaphor for your personal choices and immediate life circumstances. So when we think about this, this all then comes into our appreciation for David, a man after God's own heart. Acts chapter 13 and 14 kind of contextualize that for us. Not perfect, skilled with the harp, skilled with lyrics, skilled in many ways as a king, skilled and competent as leading an army, but he is imperfectly presented in that full perspective for us. And all the information we bring into play then have to shape our understanding of him, which will then also shape our understanding of God. Because God works with him, even though you and I might not be comfortable doing so. I'm not sure I would want to be David's guardsman after the Bathsheba experience. I mean, I don't know about that. I think I'm going out into the wilds. I'll be good. I feel like the circumstances, we're taking our family, we're out. And so we kind of think about this. So this then, in the rise of David, where he is going to be ascending to position over the throne, he's anointed as king in a time frame where Israel should contain the entire area, but functionally they have about half. They don't even have some of the strongest city centers at this point. Jerusalem really isn't a thing. It grows out of what we now refer to in that area as the city of David, which is a smaller portion of the area that would have had empty space between it and what becomes the modern statement about the temple on the mount. Saul's son, Ishbosheth, was then in this transitional period said to be king, and Mahanaim by Abner, Saul's chief captain. He claimed to be king over Gilead, the Asherites, Jezreel, Ephraim, Benjamin, and then all Israel. But look, is all Israel really a worthwhile thing at this point? What exactly is all Israel? When they're scattered to the winds, half of the land is owned by the Philistines. It's a hollow declaration. It is, if you're thinking about it this way, a perfect 10th century BC example of government propaganda. We're so strong and mighty, and I am your great and mighty king. When their nation is basically, at this point, paper. Every time you're reading about news reports and current events, you probably run across some nation somewhere that said basically the same thing. You know, we have the best armies. We have the most land. We have the best economy. You know, and look, do not be naive and think the nations that Christians are part of, including us, people don't do that too. They do it all the time. Just how it is, because people are involved. I wish it wasn't. I wish it was clearer and easier, but it's just not. So you have this empty boast that takes place. We got 4 minutes or so left, by the way. Meanwhile, in this context, David's own tribe of Judah made him king in Hebron, or Judah. And as should be obvious, that's going to lead to a power struggle between the two of them. For 2 years, David's men, Joab, murder Abner, and then Ishbosheth was murdered by 2 of his own servants. David then, at that point, becomes the king. Let's pause there so we can have some time for some reflection and thoughts about this before we go into the positive or upward section of the reign of David to a certain degree. Is that a really great entry into kingship from a heavenly standpoint or from your moral compass standpoint? Now, outside of that, if you were to think about history of humankind, does that seem different from any other king and their rise to power? How their monarchies are started? Look, if you go back into any kingdom currently that uses a monarchy as its form of government, pretty much all of them, I'm saying pretty much because I don't know 100% definitively, but it's so close to that it's nearly there. Monarchies are established by bloodshed. The next thing they do is they slaughter everybody who's not part of the current line, especially if they have some small, minuscule portion of blood from the earlier line. David becomes unique to a certain degree that he allows one part of Saul's family to kind of continue on. It's part of the story of he allows that what we would consider the lame son to a physically infirm son to continue on. This also might hint to us what David's rule could entail too. Because he is the king, he accomplished it in kingly ways, earthly king method. It's certainly going to shift our perspective away from what we want him to be is over here, and we're thinking about that, but what he actually is a little different. And when you're reading over the course of the next couple of weeks, I encourage you to read some from Chronicles and not just from 1 Samuel, because Chronicles will present us a picture of the idea of a king that everyone wanted. Samuel and Kings tell us the story of the kings that they had. And even though imperfections about moral character are found in both, Chronicles is trying to get us to look forward in its story and say there's something better coming who will be like these kings in these ways. Samuel says, but these are the ways that they failed. And King says this is the way that they failed. Any last thoughts or comments in our 35 seconds? There's a whole lot of time I gave you. We don't have our regular questions at the end. If you've got something extra you'd like to ask about, feel free to reach out to me. We'll have some more map work responsibilities coming up, but for a while, our map is fairly well situated at this point. We kind of know where things are. Thanks, everybody.